Hello and welcome to the next in our Women of the Bible study. This week it's very familiar two characters, that of Naomi and of Ruth. So familiar, our whole book was dedicated to Ruth. So we're not looking at specific sections of verses, but rather the whole book. It's only a few chapters, not very long at all. So Naomi, we know as the mother-in-law of Ruth. During the period of the Judges, approximately 1200 BC, a famine in the region of Bethlehem caused Elimelech to take his wife Naomi and their two sons to the green fields of Moab, east of the Dead Sea. Shortly after arriving, however, Elimelech died, and Naomi was left as an alien to work in a nation that practiced polygamy and idol worship. In time, her two sons chose wives, Ruth and Orpah, before whom Naomi continued to live a pious life of dedication to God. As a widow and a single parent, she demonstrated inner strength. When both of her sons died, she faced her destitution with resoluteness, determined to return to her home in Israel. She believed that God dealt harshly with her. Her life had been disappointing, but her faith was intact. Consequently, she insisted that her daughters-in-law return to their mothers' homes. Both of them resisted, but eventually Orpah, the widow of Chilion, returned. Ruth, however, vowed to accompany Naomi back to Jerusalem, renouncing her own family and religion. Naomi learned that even in the midst of the greatest suffering and adversity, God is full of good and mercy. Having returned to her homeland, Naomi wisely introduced Ruth to her new environment and coached her on proper behavior, masterminding Ruth's contacts with Boaz, a relative of Elimelech. Naomi models the way God works through a woman who moves forward even in the midst of tragedy and trial, actively seizing every opportunity God provides, rather than waiting passively for events to happen. In the providential care of God, eventually Boaz agreed to act as the Goel, or kinsman redeemer, provided in Jewish law, buying the estate of Naomi and taking Ruth as his wife. The blessing of God on their home produced a son, Obed, who became an ancestor of King David and ultimately of Jesus Christ. Naomi had not always responded appropriately in her time of affliction. Though she acknowledged God's working in her life, she misjudged God. For example, when she said that she left Bethlehem full. Actually, it had been the emptiness of famine that had driven her family away from their homeland. She continued her analogy by accusing God of bringing her back empty. And indeed she had lost her husband and sons. But in their place, God had given her Ruth, a devoted daughter-in-law. Ruth chapter 4 and verse 15. By focusing on the negative, Naomi became so bitter, Ruth 1:20, that she could not see the good and positive plans God was working. Naomi lives as a true heroine. Her stalwart faith during years of adversity and her careful tutoring of her young protege Ruth under difficult circumstances exemplify a woman of deep spiritual understanding. The result of her wisdom shines throughout Scripture. And this brings us on to the flip side, that of Ruth. Ruth, as we saw with Naomi, Naomi had moved to Moab, so Ruth was a Moabitess. She grew up on the high plateau south of the Arnon River, probably in a polygamous nation as a worshipper of the false god Chemosh. A Hebrew family came from Bethlehem to Moab, and they were different. The mother, Naomi, was treated with respect by her husband Elimelech. Ruth, who was asked to be the bride of Naomi's son Mahlon, was thus introduced into a close, mentoring relationship with the wise, stable woman who she came to love and admire. Ruth and her sister-in-law Orpah bonded closely with Naomi. The three women clung together as they watched their husbands die. Naomi had heard that the famine in Bethlehem was past, and she wanted to return home. She strongly urged her daughters-in-law to return to their respective homes to live in the women's quarters so that once again they would be eligible for marriage. Both young women wanted to stay with her, but after an emotional farewell, Orpah relented and returned to her home. Ruth, however, steadfastly clung to Naomi. Her name is a contraction of the Hebrew Ruth, from the root for sight, meaning something worth seeing, or possibly friendship. Ruth understood that moving to Bethlehem meant total renunciation of her heritage and a lifetime of living as a foreigner. Her vow to Naomi stands as one of the most beautiful statements of commitment in history. Ruth 1:16 and 17. The arrival of the two women in Bethlehem marked the beginning of a new life for Ruth. She worked in the barley fields of Naomi's relative, Boaz, gleaning the edges left for the poor people. The stalks of grain were collected and threshed with a heavy wooden hand tool. Then, with a large fork, the grain was lifted in the air to allow the wind to blow away the chaff. Many of the poor women flirted with the reapers and tried to steal grain, but Ruth soon gained a reputation for such honesty and integrity that the owner commended her. Following the wise counsel of her mother-in-law, humble Ruth won the respect and eventually the love of Naomi's kinsman Boaz, who bought the estate of Naomi and took Ruth as his wife. In so doing, he became a kinsman redeemer. Leviticus 25 and verse 25 for more on that. Ruth lives in history as a model of womanhood, willing in joy and confidence to break with her past on the basis of God's revelation, taught to her by a loving mother-in-law. God uses the faithfulness of ordinary women to accomplish his extraordinary plans. He provided bread for two widows through Ruth's gleaning. He provided security for the young widow Ruth through her marriage to Boaz. He provided prosperity for Naomi through Obed, the son born to Ruth and Boaz. God provided a great king for Israel and even the Messiah through this gentle woman. Thanks very much.